James Whitey Bulger, a name that struck fear into the hearts of Boston's underworld for decades. As the notorious leader of the Winter Hill Gang, Bulger ruled the city's criminal scene with an iron fist, masterminding a vast empire of gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. But his story is more than just a tale of crime and punishment. It's a shocking expose of corruption, betrayal, and the blurred lines between cops and criminals. In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into the life and crimes of Whitey Bulger, tracing his journey from a troubled youth in South Boston to his rise as one of the most powerful and feared gangsters in American history. We'll examine the key events and relationships that shaped his criminal career, including his unholy alliance with the FBI and his bitter rivalry with the Italian mafia. But we'll also explore the human cost of Bulger's reign of terror and the trail of violence and destruction he left in his wake. From the streets of Southie to the halls of justice. This is the story of a man who thought he was untouchable, until his past finally caught up with him. So buckle up and get ready for a journey into the heart of Boston's criminal underworld. This is the shocking true story of Whitey Bulger, the Irish mob king. Warning: the following video is meant for educational purposes only and should not be taken otherwise. Apex Crime Lords does not condone, encourage, or glorify the actions of the individuals covered in this program. Viewer discretion is advised. Keep watching until the end to see what's next on Apex Crime Lords. James Joseph Bulger Jr. was born on September 3, 1929, in the tough working-class neighborhood of South Boston, Massachusetts. The eldest of 6 children born to Irish Catholic parents, young James grew up in a world shaped by poverty, violence, and fierce ethnic loyalties. As a teenager, Bulger earned the nickname Whitey due to his shock of blonde hair, but he was also known for his quick temper and fearless attitude, traits that would serve him well in the rough-and-tumble world of Southeast streets. By the age of 14, Bulger had already been arrested for larceny and joined a local street gang known as the Shamrocks. In 1943, at the age of 18, Bulger enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, but his military career was short-lived. He was arrested for going AWOL and spent time in a military prison. Upon his release, Bulger returned to Boston and quickly fell back into a life of crime. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Bulger worked his way up the ranks of the city's Irish mob, starting as a small-time thief and burglar, and eventually graduating to loan sharking and bookmaking. He also developed a reputation as a ruthless enforcer, capable of brutal acts of violence to protect his turf and punish his enemies. But it was Bulger's relationship with a corrupt FBI agent named John Connolly that would truly launch his criminal career to new heights. Connolly, who was a fellow Irish-American from Southie, had known Bulger since childhood and saw him as a valuable asset in the Bureau's war against the Italian mafia. In 1975, Connolly recruited Bulger as an informant, promising him protection in exchange for information on his rivals. With the power of the FBI behind him, Bulger was now untouchable. He used his status as an informant to eliminate his competition and expand his criminal empire, all while Connolly and other corrupt agents looked the other way. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would grip the city of Boston for decades to come. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, Whitey Bulger's power and influence in Boston's underworld grew to unprecedented heights. With his newly forged alliance with the FBI, Bulger was able to operate with virtual free reign, using his informant status to take out his rivals and consolidate his control over the city's rackets. At the center of Bulger's criminal empire was the Winter Hill Gang, a fierce crew of Irish-American mobsters based in the Somerville neighborhood of Boston. Under Bulger's leadership, the gang expanded into new territories and new rackets, from drug trafficking and extortion to illegal gambling and arms dealing. Bulger was a hands-on boss, personally overseeing the gang's operations and dealing out brutal punishments to anyone who crossed him. He was known for his explosive temper and his ruthless tactics, which included beatings, strangulations, and even execution carried out in broad daylight. But Bulger was also a cunning strategist, forging alliances and playing his enemies against each other to maintain his grip on power. He cultivated a network of corrupt politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officials who provided him with protection and inside information. At the same time, Bulger worked to create a Robin Hood-like image in the streets of Southie, portraying himself as a defender of the neighborhood against outsiders and rival gangs. He was known for his generosity to local charities and his willingness to help out residents in need, even as he ruthlessly exploited and terrorized the community behind the scenes. As Bulger's power and wealth grew, so did his reputation as a larger-than-life figure in Boston's underworld. He became the subject of countless myths and legends, with stories of his brutal exploits and narrow escapes passing into gangster lore. But even as he reveled in his status as the king of Boston's streets, Bulger was sowing the seeds of his own downfall. His increasingly erratic behavior and his reliance on violence to solve every problem were causing rifts within his own organization and drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies outside of Boston. At the same time, Bulger's cozy relationship with the FBI was starting to unravel, as new agents and officials began to question the Bureau's unholy alliance with the Irish mob. The stage was set for a reckoning that would shake the foundations of Boston's criminal underworld and bring Whitey Bulger's reign of terror to a shocking end. As the 1980s drew to a close, Whitey Bulger's grip on power in Boston's underworld seemed unshakable. With his fearsome reputation, his vast network of criminal enterprises, and his high-level government connections, the Irish mob appeared to be untouchable. But behind the scenes, cracks were starting to appear in Bulger's carefully constructed empire. His increasingly erratic behavior and his hair-trigger temper were causing dissension within the ranks of the Winter Hill Gang, with some members questioning his leadership and his ability to keep the organization on track. At the same time, Bulger's relationship with the FBI handler John Connolly was becoming increasingly strained. As new agents and officials rotated into the Boston office, they began to question the Bureau's cozy relationship with the Irish mob and to probe deeper into Bulger's activities. Despite these warning signs, Bulger remained defiant and seemingly secure in his position. He continued to expand his criminal empire, branching out into new rackets like narcotics trafficking and real estate fraud. He also used his vast wealth and influence to buy political favors and to keep key allies in positions of power. But even as he tightened his grip on the city, Bulger was facing new threats from outside his traditional sphere of influence. The Italian Mafia, a long and bitter rival of the Irish mob, was making inroads into Boston's criminal underworld, and the tension between the two groups were escalating into open warfare. In 1994, the simmering conflict erupted into violence when Bulger allegedly ordered a hit on the leader of the Patriarcha crime family, Frank Salemme. The brazen attack sent shockwaves through the city's underworld and drew the attention of federal law enforcement agencies, who began to close in on Bulger and his associates. Feeling the heat, Bulger made a fateful decision. In late 1994, he abruptly disappeared from Boston, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a power vacuum at the top of the city's criminal hierarchy. For years, Bulger's whereabouts remained a mystery, the subject of endless speculation and rumors. Some claimed he had been killed by his enemies, while others believed he had fled the country to escape prosecution. But the truth was even stranger than fiction, and it would take more than a decade for the full story of Whitey Bulger's fall from power to finally come to light. In the years following Whitey Bulger's sudden disappearance from Boston, the once feared mob boss became a ghost, a phantom whose legend only grew in his absence. But behind the scenes, the forces that had enabled his rise to power were rapidly unraveling, setting the stage for a stunning downfall. The first domino to fall was Bulger's corrupt FBI handler John Connolly. In 1995, Connolly was indicted on charges of racketeering and obstruction of justice, accused of protecting Bulger and his associates from prosecution in exchange for information and kickbacks. The scandal sent shockwaves to the Bureau and raised troubling questions about the extent of corruption within law enforcement. As the investigation into Connolly and the FBI's relationship with Bulger widened, more and more of the mob boss's secrets began to spill out. Former associates and rivals came forward to testify against him, painting a picture of a ruthless killer who had been allowed to operate with impunity for decades. In 1999, Bulger was indicted on federal racketeering charges, along with his lifetime lieutenant Stephen the Rifleman Flemmy and several other members of the Winter Hill Gang. The indictment laid bare the stunning scope of Bulger's criminal empire, from murder and extortion to drug trafficking and money laundering. But Bulger himself remained elusive, his whereabouts unknown to even his closest confidants. It wasn't until 2011, after 16 years on the run, that the law finally caught up with the notorious Irish mob boss. Acting on a tip, FBI agents tracked Bulger to a modest apartment in Santa Monica, California, where he had been living a quiet life with his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Grieg. Inside the apartment, they found a cache of weapons, more than $800,000 in cash, and a trove of documents and memorabilia related to Bulger's criminal career. In the end, it was Bulger's own arrogance and his inability to leave the past behind that led to his capture. Despite his fearsome reputation and his decades of experience evading the law, he had grown complacent in his old age, convinced of his own invincibility. Bulger's arrest and subsequent trial captivated the nation, as sordid details of his life and crimes were laid bare for all to see. In 2013, he was convicted on 31 counts, including participation in 11 murders, and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. But even in prison, Bulger's story was not over. In October of 2018, he was found beaten to death in his cell at the Hazleton Federal Penitentiary in West Virginia, the victim of a brutal attack by fellow inmates. It was a shocking end to a life that had been defined by violence, betrayal, and a ruthless pursuit of power at all costs. The rise and fall of James Whitey Bulger is a tale that reads like a Hollywood script, a story of ambition, corruption, violence, and ultimately retribution. But it's also a deeply American story, one that reflects the dark underbelly of power and the human capacity for both good and evil. On one level, Bulger's story is a classic gangster tale, the rise of a street-smart kid from the tough streets of Southie who used his wits, his fists, and his ruthless cunning to build a criminal empire that spanned decades. But it's also a story about the corruption of institutions, the blurred lines between cops and criminals, and the price of unchecked power. Bulger's reign of terror was enabled, in large part, by the very people who were supposed to be protecting society from the likes of him. His unholy alliance with the FBI, and the willingness of corrupt agents like John Connolly to turn a blind eye to his crimes, allowed him to operate unchecked for years, leaving a trail of bodies and broken lives in his wake. At the same time, Bulger's story is a cautionary tale about the seductive lure of power and the corrosive effects of greed and arrogance. Despite his fearsome reputation and his seeming invincibility, Bulger was ultimately undone by his own arrogance and his inability to adapt to a changing world. In the end, the legacy of Whitey Bulger is a complicated one. To some, he was a folk hero, a defender of his neighborhood against outside forces, and a symbol of Irish-American pride and resilience. To others, he was a monster, a psychopath who terrorized his own community and left a trail of destruction that still haunts Boston to this day. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Bulger's story is the importance of accountability and the rule of law. For too long, Bulger and his allies were allowed to operate above the law, protected by a corrupt system that valued loyalty over justice. It was only when that system began to crumble, and when brave individuals stepped forward to speak the truth, that Bulger's crimes were finally brought to light. As we reflect on the life and times of Whitey Bulger, it's important to remember that his story is not just a tale of one man's rise and fall, but a reflection of the larger forces that shaped our society. It's a reminder of the need for vigilance, for transparency, and for a commitment to justice that transcends the seductive pull of power and greed. In the end, the story of Whitey Bulger is a tragedy of a wasted potential, of lives cut short, and a community that is still grappling with the scars of his crimes. But it's also a story of hope that by confronting the darkness of our past, we can build a brighter future for ourselves and for generations to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of Boston's criminal underworld. We hope that this exploration of the life and times of Whitey Bulger has been both informative and thought-provoking, and that it has shed a light on the chapter of American history that continues to resonate to this day. Up next, from the streets of Medellin to the heights of criminal infamy, one man's rise to power would change the face of international drug trafficking. Through a lethal combination of cunning, charisma, and ruthless violence, Pablo Escobar transformed a small-time smuggling operation into a global cocaine empire, amassing billions of dollars and an army of loyal soldiers along the way. But as his wealth and influence grew, so did the target on his back. Join us as we trace the meteoric ascent and devastating fall of the man who had become known as the King of Cocaine, and explore the lasting impact of his bloody reign on Colombia and the rest of the world. The story of Pablo Escobar, The Making and Unmaking of a Drug Lord Legend.